Anyway, so they find out that before the Valiant was destroyed, the crew had put in requests for all available information on ESP, extrasensory perception in humans. And so Kirk asks Dehner about the subject. She says, quote, "It is a fact that some people can sense future happenings, read the backs of playing cards, and so on, but the Esper capacity is always quite limited." So this is interesting, partly since it's a metaphysical component of the Star Trek universe that is introduced here at the very beginning of Star Trek, but for the most part, afterwards doesn't end up being developed or maintained in future Star Trek. I think I remember one episode in The Next Generation where there was this small space station with child prodigies who had psychic powers. But other than that, the idea of ESP being present in humans in small quantities as a normal part of the universe, that's a storytelling device that pretty much completely disappears after this. And especially the language of ESP and espers and all that kind of stuff completely disappears. In contrast, for example, to Blizzard's StarCraft universe, in which the concept of psionic energy and humans having ESP and all that kind of stuff is a consistent story element throughout. And then another reason this is interesting is because I think this probably says something about the culture of ideas from back in the late 60s. I don't know where things are at in the field of parapsychology these days, but I remember back when I was a teenager for a school assignment, I ended up doing a kind of surface level research project on the topic using books from my library. And thinking back, it seems like the really pro parapsychology books that I came across, it seems like they were something like 60s-ish books, give or take a decade, maybe 60s, 70s, I don't know. That's my hazy generalized memory. Now, in 2025, when I did a couple of quick Google searches in preparation for this video, it seems like the parapsychology movement, it goes back to the 30s and 40s, but it was getting bigger in the late 60s, and it has been quickly fading since about the 80s. So according to the New World Encyclopedia, the origins of parapsychology are associated with the spiritualist movement of the mid-1900s. It was preceded by similar precursors starting in the 1780s with the followers of Franz Mesmer, where they had some similar ideas. Mesmer is the guy who basically discovered hypnosis, if I'm understanding things correctly. But then in 1882, the Society for Psychical Research was founded in London with the support of William James and others. Back at that point, the term used for the investigation of paranormal phenomena, the term was psychical research. It wasn't until the 1930s, with the work of J.B. Rhine at Duke University, that the term parapsychology took over as the term that people would use to talk about this kind of stuff moving forward. So, according to the New World Encyclopedia, those experiments done in the 1930s by Rhine at Duke University, quote, are often thought of as the beginning of parapsychology as a science. And then the article explains, Rhine is perhaps best known for his methodology of using card guessing and dice rolling experiments in the laboratory in an attempt to find a statistical validation of extrasensory perception. This type of experimental approach has characterized much of contemporary parapsychology. Rhine also popularized the term extrasensory perception, or ESP. So that was in the 30s, or at least it was beginning in the 30s, and as the article continues, it gives us an even better idea of why maybe these concepts would have been particularly appealing to the imaginations of Star Trek writers in the late 60s, because as the article goes on, it says, the so-called Rhine Revolution attempted to accomplish several things. Not only did Rhine attempt to provide parapsychology with a systematic, progressive program of sound experimentation, which would characterize the conditions and extent of psi phenomena rather than merely trying to prove their existence, but he also wanted to give the field of parapsychology academic and scientific legitimacy. Rhine helped form the first long-term university laboratory devoted to parapsychology in the Duke University Laboratory, and later founded the independent Rhine Research Center. As a result of Rhine's work, much of experimental parapsychology today is geared toward ordinary people as subjects rather than a few select mediums or gifted psychics. Rhine also helped found the Journal of Parapsychology in 1937, which has remained one of the most respected journals in the field, and the Parapsychological Association in 1957, an association that was accepted into the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1969. End quote. So, when this Star Trek episode had aired back in 1967, the Parapsychological Association had just been formed 10 years earlier in 1957. And this was 2 years before that would be accepted into the AAAS in 1969. So that article goes on to talk about parapsychological organizations formed in the 70s, but it seems like after that, according to Wikipedia at least, it seems that everything started to wind down in the 80s. So Wikipedia says, Since the 1980s, contemporary parapsychological research has waned considerably in the United States. Early research was considered inconclusive, and parapsychologists faced strong criticism from their academic colleagues. Some effects thought to be paranormal, for example, the effects of Kirlian photography, thought by some to represent a human aura, disappeared under more stringent controls, leaving those avenues of research at dead ends. Most parapsychology research in the U.S. is now confined to private institutions funded by private sources. After 28 years of research, Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, PAIR, which studied psychokinesis, closed in 2007. End quote. So that last quote is from Wikipedia. Anyway, so it turns out, as we look back at the history of parapsychology, it turns out that Star Trek was just at that perfect point, right in the middle of parapsychology's highest level of popular appeal, more or less. So then it kind of makes perfect sense for Star Trek to include that as part of its landscape in this opening episode. And the response that Dr. Dehner gives almost sounds like it comes straight out of the pro-parapsychology literature, because if you remember, her words were, "It is a fact that some people can sense future happenings, read the backs of playing cards, and so on, but the Esper capacity is always quite limited." And so what she's referring to there is the kind of research that was begun in the 30s, which used special cards called Dehner cards to see if people could use ESP to tell what the card is supposed to say, either by telepathic or by clairvoyant means. And I think it was around the same time when rolling of dice was used to see if people could psychokinetically influence the results of a random process like rolling dice to get the number that you want. And Dr. Dehner's conclusion, just like the parapsychology enthusiasts back in the day, her conclusion is that based on the statistical data from these studies, as she puts it, it is a fact that this happens. But, as she says, the Esper capacity is always quite limited. And also that term Esper, I'm pretty sure that was a term that I ran into when I did that research paper. I'm pretty sure that's a term from that same body of literature, and it derives from ESP, or Esper. But when I try to do a Google search to find out if that's true or not, I can't really find any good info on the term. So, in this one-off episode here at the very beginning of Star Trek, one of the background elements of the initial Star Trek universe was that all that parapsychological research done in the early 20th century was pretty much correct. So much so that by the 23rd century, it has become so well established that people are routinely tested and given Esper ratings. In that sense, it kind of reminds me a lot, actually. It kind of reminds me a lot of Blizzard's StarCraft universe that they created for their 1998 real-time strategy PC game. In that universe, humans naturally have psionic powers at low levels, but due to the advancing of evolution, certain gifted people begin to emerge in the population, and those people are selected through testing when they're young, and then trained to become what are called ghosts. If you've ever played StarCraft, you might remember Sarah Kerrigan, who was a ghost, and she could read people's thoughts, and she's basically a special operative for the Terran military. But whereas certain Terrans had a certain amount of psionic power that they might try to hone, the Protoss, the aliens, have highly advanced psionic abilities, just as a matter of course, and the most advanced Protoss, the Templar, can summon psionic storms, they can transform themselves into these powerful archons, etc. So you could say that StarCraft basically took this popular idea that Star Trek had kind of started to lean into in this episode here, but whereas Star Trek pretty quickly afterwards stepped away from that parapsychology narrative, StarCraft decided to turn that into a central characteristic of their particular sci-fi universe and turn it into a source of some of their key plot lines. So Kerrigan gets captured by the Zerg because they can sense her psionic emanations, and then she starts sending telepathic visions to James Raynor, begging him to come save her, etc., etc. So, getting back to Star Trek, this is a bit of a one-off in the Star Trek universe, but there is also a Next Generation episode that I don't have clear memories about. I don't know what the episode name was, but I just remember there was this space station, and on it there was this small colony of gifted children with ESP and psychokinetic powers, and it was believed that this was a natural mutation, but no one knew why it happened. But if I remember right, it turned out in the end that there was some kind of alien interference going on, and it didn't end up being what it appeared to be at all. But anyway, at least at the beginning of the episode, the setup was kind of a return to this concept here. But for the most part, the rest of Star Trek moves this category into the exclusive purview of alien powers, rather than something that's within the normal range for humans, or even the abnormal range for humans. And then terms or concepts like ESP, Espers, Dehner cards, and all that kind of stuff is just completely gone. We'll never see it again. Though I'm pretty sure I do remember Harry in Voyager reporting that the ship's sensors picked up psionic energy at a couple of points when aliens were doing weird things. So there's that term is in there, but that's about the extent of it as far as I can tell. And besides, I think that the terms psionic and psi probably end up being more associated with science fiction these days than the actual historical field of parapsychology. So these kinds of things get relegated to aliens rather than humans. And I think the aliens that represent these concepts the most throughout mainstream Star Trek, to me, seems like definitely the Vulcans and the Betazoids. In particular, my memory of Counselor Troi in the opening episode of TNG, it seems like the actress was really trying to provide a performance as a psychic, particularly in that scene where she's in the tunnels underneath the city and she's feeling all these things that the great giant alien is feeling. Also, some of Spock's performances in TOS also seem to have a little bit of that psychic reading kind of flavor to the performance. So definitely we could say that Vulcans and Betazoids are sort of the spiritual successors to this concept, but done in a way that's much further removed from anything that could be mistaken for credulity toward parapsychology as a field, kind of sliding it over into the slot of imaginative fantasy instead. I think we could also bring up a lot of other telepathic or supernatural aliens in the same context, especially cases of aliens or humans evolving into a more supernatural form. But I think for me, Vulcans and Betazoids stand out the most simply because the things that humans were supposedly going to be able to evolve into, or the things that humans supposedly could do in small ways, are specifically the kinds of things that Vulcans and Betazoids do, minus the psychokinetic part. I don't see a lot of aliens in Star Trek making things float or anything like that. But not that this was necessarily a conscious transition that the Star Trek writers did, because it's kind of a well-established sci-fi trope at this point for aliens to have powers of those kinds. And I wonder, since a lot of early sci-fi in the 30s, 40s, and 50s would have been contemporaneous with the popularity of parapsychology, it kind of makes me wonder, it kind of seems likely to me that there's probably a real correlation there. And then in terms of what preceded Star Trek more immediately on television, lately I've been enjoying watching the 1962 comedy My Favorite Martian, in which a Martian lands on Earth and tries to coexist with humans. And it's interesting because he looks completely human except when his antennae pop out. And he's extremely smart. He often says humans are far too illogical. And he has these ESP and psychokinetic powers because he can levitate things, he can read minds, and he can become invisible. So you can kind of see a little bit of Spock in some aspects of the portrayal of that alien there in My Favorite Martian. But I think it also illustrates the idea that giving aliens various parapsychological powers was definitely part of the picture in science fiction long before the launch of Star Trek in 1967. And while I haven't read a lot of 50s sci-fi, I think it makes perfect sense to notice that the golden age of sci-fi, which I think was roughly the 50s, depending who you ask, that was also the same time when the attractiveness of the field of parapsychology was rapidly moving toward its zenith. And then to change the topic a little, on a more completely symbolic level, it's interesting to observe one thematic overlap between the concept of Dr. Dehner here and the concept of Counselor Troi in The Next Generation. We find out that Dr. Dehner became a psychiatrist partly because her high Esper abilities made that field appealing to her and made it more of a natural fit. And similarly, Deanna Troi is a character built on the idea that ESP, in her case, her supernatural betazoid empathy, is a natural fit for a counselor. Now, I've already mentioned how Dr. Dehner isn't your standard empathic counselor type, but more of a researcher. But still, I still think it's interesting to note that in both cases, the Star Trek writers are kind of drawing a link between natural empathy or interpersonal skills or clinical intuition and supernatural ESP type abilities. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about, whether the creative team on Star Trek was making that connection on purpose or whether it's just a natural thing that emerged as the story came together. I think in an expressive or a metaphorical way, there's something really artistic about the idea of doing this fantasy reframe of these intangible senses in real life of empathy and intuition and things like that, and making a fantasy reframe by switching these out for supernatural powers like ESP or telepathy. Deanna Troi is sort of like a fanciful, artistic recasting of the Rogerian ideal of the empathetic counselor. Somebody who knows what you're feeling because she can feel it too. Someone who has a pretty good idea of whether you're telling the truth or not and whether there might be more information you haven't yet begun to share. Now, unfortunately, I don't think the portrayal of Troi, especially in the early seasons of TNG, I don't think necessarily did a good job of approximating what actual empathy looks like in practice, though it definitely got better later on. But I think the concept of Troi and the concept of supernatural empathy as a fantasy expansion of the themes of real-life empathy and related concepts, I think that's a really poetic and a really fun concept. And I think it was, probably without anybody realizing it, it was kind of foreshadowed a little bit in this alt pilot episode here by this background element that Dehner was attracted to the field of people studies because she had higher extrasensory awareness than most people do. So they find out from the tapes that ultimately what happened to the Valiant was that the captain of the Valiant ended up giving the order to self-destruct his own ship. And, of course, Kirk and friends decide to fly on over there to where it all happened so they can get a good look close up. Can't imagine anything going wrong with that. So they encounter the phenomenon. The ship takes serious damage and they hightail it out of there as fast as they can. But before they can get out of there, Dehner and Mitchell are zapped by the phenomenon. It seems to have hit Mitchell harder than Dehner. And then when Gary rolls over, his eyes are glowing. And the first thing we are shown for this next scene is Kirk and Spock looking at the Esper ratings and crew profiles for Dehner and Mitchell. So we get to see what a microtape looks like. Back when I did my video on Charlie X, I concluded that as best as I can tell, it seems like microtape is a word made up for Star Trek as a combination of microfilm and magnetic tape. And I guess this right here is microtape, which is basically Star Trek's version of microfilm, I guess. So this is Elizabeth Dehner, PhD. There's her address. Her birthplace was Delman. And then we've got Gary Mitchell's page. There's also a strong tendency through the maternal bloodline toward Esper-oriented abilities, dating back through at least 6 generations to both males and females who dabbled in metaphysical studies and, in at least one case, a female ancestor who was interested in spiritual readings. And those references toward the end, those references to individuals who dabbled in metaphysical studies and spiritual readings, I'm guessing that's a reference to stuff like mediumship or magic or other things that relate loosely to psychics and generally occultic type themes, which is relevant because in a minute we're going to get what sounds like loose associations to the kind of witch hunt type story element. So anyway, Dehner comes to the bridge to report on some information, and Kirk tells her that they've concluded that the reason the Energy Birds selected these 2 crew members seems to be because of their high Esper rating, Mitchell's being the highest of all. And Dehner's immediate reaction is a noticeably defensive one. She says, "Espers are simply people with flashes of insight." And then it goes on. But once again, it seems clear that in this opening episode, the background within the Star Trek universe assumes some established history about the nature and identity of ESP and Espers in the history of the Federation. And it seems like this assumed history is based loosely on the concept of witch hunts, as seen, for example, in the Salem witch trials. The idea that there are people purported to have magical abilities and that such people are under suspicion and prejudice by others. So it seems that Dehner has grown up with a felt need to be defensive about the topic of Espers, at least in certain sectors. And this use of the theme here, it kind of reminds me of what J.K. Rowling did in the first Harry Potter book, when she identified the witches from incidents like the Salem witch trials to have been supernatural people of the Hogwarts variety. So in effect, Rowling sets up her universe to side with the victims by saying that they were witches with powers, but that's a good thing. They were Hogwarts witches, and that's a good thing. And what makes me feel like this is probably the same thing that the writers are doing here is because in the animated series of Star Trek, there was that episode with the Lucian character, which actually ended up talking explicitly about the Salem witch trials and concluding that the witches were followers of Lucifer, aka Lucian, who was really a very good guy who was misunderstood. So just like what Rowling did, the Star Trek writers also suggested that the witches who were killed for being witches actually were witches, and they actually were following Satan, but that's actually a kind of good thing. Anyway, so in this case, in this episode here, there's no Lucian or anything like that, and there's no mention of witchcraft or occult practice or anything like that, but just the general association between psychics or the paranormal with suspicion, fear, and prejudice. So just like Harry Potter's step-parents were afraid of him because things mysteriously happened when he got upset, and just like in the Harry Potter universe, young Tom Riddle's caretakers in Book 5 were afraid of him because he was actually using his powers to secretly bully and terrify other children. So in the same way, in this version of the Star Trek universe, Espers in recent centuries have ended up getting accused of various kinds of accidents and things like that they may or may not have been involved in, such as starting fires and things like that. So whereas having a high ESPER rating can be an advantage in some contexts, like when it says in Mitchell's report, it says he was especially good at communicating telepathically with certain telepathic aliens, but it can also be a big liability because of social reasons. You may be discriminated against, you may be looked at with suspicion, you may even be accused of being the cause of freak accidents that you're too close to. Anyway, so next up in the story here, Kirk goes to visit Mitchell in sickbay. And Mitchell has been lying in bed reading books, and look at that nostalgic CRT screen there. Even that